Today, the Misfits are known as one of the biggest punk rock acts of all time, with their infamous logo, the Crimson Ghost, immediately recognizable, even to people who aren't familiar with the music, from pop stars wearing it to their merch made available at major retailers like H&M and even Walmart. However, there was a period of time when the Misfits were actually a pretty underground band that was shrouded in mystery. This was especially the case after the Misfits broke up in 1983, and the man who conjured up the idea for most of the band's music and image kept an iron grip on the Misfits' legacy for an entire decade, while the other members faded into obscurity. Hi there everyone, I'm Joe Meyer and this is Heavy Academia, a place for discussions about heavy music. And today, I want to bring up Glenn Danzig's monopoly over the Misfits from 1983 up into the early 1990s, in hopes of sparking a conversation about the ownership of underground music, and the question of whether or not the Misfits' legacy should have stayed in the crypt that Glenn Danzig had made for it, and remained more of an underground cult phenomenon than the mainstream multi-million-dollar enterprise that it has become in the 21st century. And as usual, I have absolutely no monopoly over this story, and I want to hear what you all think, so please join in the conversation by letting us know your thoughts in the comments. And so the Misfits were formed in Lodi, New Jersey in 1977 by Glenn Danzig, who would go on to recruit Jerry Only on bass, and with a revolving cast of drummers and guitarists until Only's younger brother Doyle joined in 1980, the band became one of the most influential American punk rock groups of all time. They've been credited with pioneering horror punk, death punk, pop punk, psychobilly, hardcore punk, and extreme metal, and they've influenced a wide range of bands from Black Flag to Metallica. But despite their impact, the band remained part of the early American punk and hardcore underground, and their initial run together was pretty short-lived. Just 5 years after their formation, the Misfits abruptly broke up during their annual Halloween concert in Detroit, after their drummer got too drunk to play and had to be literally thrown out mid-set. At the end of the concert, Glenn Danzig unexpectedly announced that the band was breaking up, and that this dysfunctional show would in fact be their last. While the immediate reason for the breakup might have been this drummer debacle, according to Glenn, he and the rest of the band members were already moving in separate directions by the time the band broke up. He claimed that Jerry and Doyle were more interested in doing a quote Van Halen type of band, which he hated the thought of, and he had already been conjuring up new ideas for his own project. Now, even though Jerry Only was a co-founder of the Misfits along with Glenn, and Doyle is often considered to be a classic member, it makes a lot of sense that the Misfits ended when Glenn left. Not only did he come up with the name, write all of the lyrics, and provided a unique and recognizable voice, he was also heavily active in the Misfits branding. His DIY-driven marketing included designing each album's artwork, releasing EPs and full-lengths on the label he founded, Plan 9, and inventing the Fiend Club, the official fan club where members could join and put in mail orders for vinyls and other merchandise, and even communicate directly with the band. So after forming the Misfits in 1977 and then breaking it up in 1983, Glenn took the solo direction he had been leaning towards at the end of the Misfits' short-lived career, along with his DIY ethic for promoting his own vision, and formed the heavier but often slower, darker, and at times more metallic goth punk band SAMHAIN in the same year. And I know the correct pronunciation in ancient Gaelic is Samhain, but the band and its fans pronounced it like SAMHAIN, so that's how I'll be using it too. SAMHAIN would go on to attract the attention of producer and Def Jam co-founder Rick Rubin, who helped Glenn, along with Eerie Von, start the more bluesy metal project Danzig in 1988, where they would go on to produce hits like Mother, while their self-titled debut album would be certified gold in 1994. In addition, Glenn would go on to start his own comic book company called Verotic, and was even eventually offered to play the role of Marvel character Wolverine in a feature film, which he turned down instead to focus on his touring duties with Danzig. So why does any of this matter? Well, it goes to show that Glenn Danzig was on an upward journey of success in his career, but one burning question remained on his mind. What about the legacy of the Misfits, whose cult status only kept growing after the band broke up? So despite moving on from the Misfits and finding success on his own, Glenn Danzig couldn't overlook the fact that the band he founded in the late 70s continued gaining traction and spreading its influence, and with it, a consistently rising demand, bolstered in no small part by Metallica covering 2 Misfits songs in 1987. And so Glenn responded to this undying demand for the Misfits by putting out compilations of previously unreleased and live Misfits songs through his Plan 9 label in partnership with Caroline Records. And these included Legacy of Brutality in 1985, the compilation album commonly dubbed Collection 1 in 1986, and the live album Evil Live in 1987. As well as the beginnings of what would later become known as Collection 2, which was released a little bit later in 1995. So while Glenn distanced himself from the Misfits in his career with Danzig, at the same time, he would continue remastering, marketing, and selling their music. And so, it might seem like after they broke up in 1983, the Misfits had become a post-mortem money-making machine controlled by Glenn Danzig that had little to do with any kind of artistic value or genuine attachment to the songs. In fact, this would make perfect sense for Glenn from a business standpoint, since by selling these Misfits compilations, he could keep his own Plan 9 label propped up and continue doing the things he actually wanted to do, like focusing on going more metallic with SAMHAIN and later with Danzig. But as is often the case with musicians, the potential for money-making was no doubt an important aspect, but isn't probably quite the whole story either. In addition to compiling and selling old songs, especially from the Misfits' ill-fated debut album Static Age, Glenn personally went into the studio for the compilation's releases and re-recorded many of the songs himself. And he had SAMHAIN bassist Eerie Von, who had never even been in the Misfits, dub over some of the tracks. And this is really interesting since many of the songs that are considered to be Misfits classics, especially from the compilations Legacy of Brutality and Collection 1, are actually overdubbed and remixed versions released by Glenn Danzig years after the original recordings. This is especially the case for hits like Some Kinda Hate and Hybrid Moments. And so this brings up the question, if it was all just about banking on the Misfits' name and some of their classic songs, then why would Glenn Danzig go through the trouble of re-recording so many tracks? Could it be because he thought that better production and dubbing over certain segments could lead to better sales? That is certainly possible, but it could also be that he genuinely wanted to make the songs sound a bit more like how he had imagined and wanted them to be from the beginning. After all, Glenn was very protective of his vision that created the band and quite clearly considered it to be his own brainchild. Now, despite keeping Misfits vinyls and merch in the market through Plan 9, Glenn never seemed to have the drive to go beyond a few rare releases and keeping the Misfits a relatively underground cult phenomenon throughout the mid to late 1980s. Now, having seemingly faded into obscurity, Misfits founding bassist Jerry Only and his younger brother Doyle watched the success of Glenn's tinkering with the corpse of the Misfits and banking on its name, logo, and songs through the oil and dust of their father's New Jersey machine shop. Having been alienated from the Misfits due to Glenn's control over Plan 9 and his claim as the sole songwriter, Jerry Only and Doyle were completely left out of the sales and production of the compilations Glenn released. Now, the exclusion of Jerry Only from the profits Plan 9 made seemed to contradict Glenn's own opinion about his role in the Misfits. For example, when asked in an interview why he created SAMHAIN, instead of just getting all new members and keeping the Misfits name, Glenn claimed that it wouldn't make sense to keep the Misfits around without Jerry, admitting that, "I think Jerry was kinda important in the Misfits, whether he wrote songs or not. As long as it was me and Jerry, it was kinda the Misfits." So, while much of the Misfits' sound and look were directly the creation of Glenn, Jerry and I would argue Doyle were a major part of the band's image, especially recognizable through their contribution of the devil lock hairstyle. Amidst mounting tensions with Glenn Danzig and his monopoly over everything Misfits related, and not wanting to fade into musical irrelevance, Jerry Only conjured up the idea of starting a Christian heavy metal supergroup, and along with Doyle, started a band called Christ the Conqueror in 1987. Now, the band never had a permanent lead singer and never toured, but they did record a full-length album that was never released. Instead, they only put out an EP called Deliver Us From Evil in 1990. Hoping to bank on Misfits fans turned off by SAMHAIN and later Danzig's new demonic directions, Jerry started his own version of the Fiend Club called the Doyle Fan Club, where he promoted Christ the Conqueror, but, of course, he also made sure to point out that he and Doyle were former Misfits members. And unable to escape from the lucrative promise the Crimson Ghost and Misfits name offered, Jerry Only correctly predicted that the demand for the band would only continue to grow in the 1990s, an idea reinforced by one of the most popular rock bands in the world, Guns N' Roses, covering the Misfits song Attitude in their 1993 album The Spaghetti Incident. But with Christ the Conqueror already a failed experiment, Jerry and Doyle turned to legal options that they had already been mulling over previously, and they decided to take Glenn Danzig to court in 1992. However, the legal battle had roots that actually went back to the time of Glenn and Plan 9's releasing of Collection 1 in the mid-80s. Based on interviews with Jerry himself and sources close to him, because of the popularity of Glenn's compilations and the Misfits craze spurred on by Metallica covering their songs, Jerry and Doyle began receiving more and more requests for Misfits-related memorabilia from friends and fans alike. But in 1986, when Jerry had a mutual friend ask Glenn about getting some old Misfits merch that Glenn had kept for Fiend Club members, Glenn responded by saying that if Jerry wanted anything from his Misfits stash, he would have to go and buy it. This apparently pissed off Jerry enough that he and Doyle got a lawyer. and they began pursuing legal actions that would help include them in the Misfits royalties, especially after Glenn had already denied their initial request for a $250,000 settlement. Now, it's safe to say that by the mid-1990s, the Misfits had become little more than a court battle by former members over consistently growing profits that none of them had foreseen back in 1983. And so between 1992 and 1994, a legal battle between former Misfits members and Glenn Danzig resulted in a settlement in favor of Jerry, Doyle, and other former members featured on the early recordings. The agreement stipulated that each of the members had rights over the trademark and would be required to divvy up the royalties from album sales, and that Caroline Records would have sole distribution rights for the recordings, and this essentially served a death spell for Glenn's Plan 9 Records. But perhaps most importantly, the agreement gave Jerry Only and the others exclusive rights over using and performing under the name Misfits. And what happened next is the reason that the Misfits have become a household name in the 21st century. After failing to recruit Danzig himself, Jerry and Doyle would get a new drummer, Dr. Chud, and hire 19-year-old Michael Emanuel, aka Michael Graves, and begin performing as the Misfits in 1995. From that point forward, the Misfits would become a touring and merchandising juggernaut that brought the band's name and logo to the shelves of countless stores across the world, and even TVs. And Glenn Danzig would distance himself from anything Misfits related until he had Doyle come up on stage and play Misfits songs with him, which is perhaps a precursor to the original Misfits reforming and playing shows together in 2016, which was actually the result of yet another court battle. But either way, the Misfits had gone from an obscure underground cult phenomenon to a Glenn Danzig piggy bank in the late 1980s to where they are today, which is a multi-million-dollar merchandising machine that hasn't shown any signs of slowing down. And also, in a lot of ways, the Misfits shifted from a Glenn Danzig monopoly from 1983 up into the mid-1990s to a Jerry-only monopoly from 1995 up until the present. So I'm curious what you all think. Should the Misfits have stayed buried in the coffin after 1983, only to be let out by Crypt Keeper Glenn Danzig when he allowed it to? Or is it only natural that the band and their image were destined to become a household name? Let us know what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time on Heavy Academia.